And welcome to the latest edition of Mr. Oshodi's Snapchat Science. Today what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be going back and mixing in our topics from last lesson and linking it to our osmosis. So today we have two objectives. We want to look at how can sports drinks, for example Lucozade, benefit athletes in terms of their performance, and two, we want to give examples of active transport. We really want to be able to define and explain the process of active transport. So let's get going. So, as athletes, athletes lose so much water. Now we lose so much water when we sweat, but at the same time we lose ions. However, we don't lose as much ions as we do water, and therefore that causes an imbalance. Now, don't forget in our last lesson we looked at osmosis and we looked at if there's an imbalance between water and ions, cells can either shrink or cells could burst. And we really want to look at today how that athletes try and maintain their water levels consistently. Now, if athletes start to get dehydrated, they start to carry out a process known as rehydration. So, for example, taking on their sports drinks. Sports drink could be Lucozade, Gatorade. Now these sports drinks are also really important because they contain glucose. Now, glucose, don't forget, from earlier on in B2, we looked at glucose is used in respiration. So as long as we've got the correct amount of sugars, so glucose, we have enough glucose to allow us to carry on respiring. Now, in terms of looking at an example like glucose or a sugar like glucose, we want to look at a process known as active transport. Now this is getting the glucose from the outside of our cells into our cells. Now, at the moment, so far what we've looked at diffusion and osmosis. Now with diffusion and osmosis, we've looked at particles moving from a high concentration to a low concentration down a concentration gradient. However, today what we're going to be looking at is active transport. What happens when there's already a high concentration of glucose inside the cells, however we still want to move glucose from the outside of the cell inside of the cell? What we do is we carry out active transport and we move particles against their concentration gradient. They're no longer moving down their concentration gradient, they're moving against their concentration gradient. So they're moving from a low concentration now to a high concentration. Now, if we look at active transport in particular, because it is not a passive process, osmosis and diffusion are passive, active transport is, as it says in the word, active. To be active, you need energy. So, active transport moves particles from a low concentration to a high concentration against their concentration gradient with the use of energy. Without this energy, active transport won't be able to take place, Now, that's a really important example for you guys to look at. We want to look at examples inside the body. And the really good example is, as we've just said, with our sports drinks, so glucose. So let's look at active transport and some key points I want you to make sure you've got down in your notes for active transport. 1, it requires energy. Osmosis and diffusion do not require energy. 2, the particles move against their concentration gradient, whereas in osmosis and diffusion they move down their concentration gradient. And 3, energy is needed. Remember what we said, energy, which pumps the particles, into the cell, and an example is moving glucose from the intestines into the blood, Now, if you guys look at the example, that we've now got on the board, outside of the cell, we're moving particles inside of the cell. Now, what I want you guys to do is pause this video and see if you can fill in the gaps of active transport. So pause the video and we'll go through it. Right, so let's go through the key terms. So, the process takes energy and this comes from respiration. It enables cells to take in substances even though there are very small concentration, Root hair cells take in nutrients using active transport, So those are the words that you needed to fit in your active transport notes. So guys, what I want you to do now is rewatch the video, get your notes, and answer questions from your book based on these videos. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and revise for the next video. Mr. Oshodi, signing out.